The third week of Lent, in the sewing room above the stables at Caudley Hall, Margaret Vane held a letter to the window and understood that the words on it were lying. She had not meant to read it. The paper had come to her the way most things came to her, folded into work. A gentleman's coat sent down for the seam at the shoulder to be let out, and in the breast pocket, forgotten or not forgotten, a single sheet folded 3 times. She had drawn it out only to keep it from the damp of the pressing cloth. She had unfolded it only to see whether it was worth returning at once or at the end of the day. The hand was neat. The lines were ordinary. It spoke of the weather at Bath, of a cousin's health, of the price of coal, and of a hope that the recipient's mother had recovered from her cold. Nothing in it should have made the small hairs rise along her forearms. Nothing in it, except that the writer had used the word coal 3 times in 11 lines, and no man writing about the weather at Bath needed to say coal 3 times. She set the iron down on its stand. Downstairs, in the long gallery, the household was being told what it already knew. The tutor engaged for the Earl's ward would be leaving at Michaelmas, and the position would go to a man of better family. And everyone agreed this was sensible, and everyone agreed it had nothing to do with anything but sense. She has a good eye for a hem, Lady Corinne Aldworth had said of Margaret that morning. In the drawing-room, to the visiting Mrs. Pole, with her fan lifted a half-inch too high, that is the whole of her. A pair of hands and a good eye for a hem. The room had decided some years ago what Margaret was. A pair of hands. She had heard it through a door, which is how servants hear most of what is said about them. And she had gone on, down the passage, with a basket of collars, and had not broken stride, because breaking stride is how they learn you can hear. She was 26 years old. She had been the daughter of a man who taught mathematics to the sons of merchants in Bristol, until a bad winter and a worse creditor had emptied the house of everything but the piano, and then of the piano too. What the room did not know, and had no reason to learn, was that her father had taught her ciphers the way other fathers taught their daughters the names of flowers. He had called it a game. He had called it the coal game, in fact, because the first key they ever used had been the coal ledger on the kitchen shelf. She looked at the letter in her hand. She looked at the word coal 3 times in 11 lines. Then she folded the paper along its old creases and put it in her apron, and went down to the gallery to hear the rest of what the household already knew. The Earl of Renmere had come into the room without anyone announcing him, which was a thing he did, and which the servants had stopped remarking on. He stood at the far window with his back to the light. Julian they called him in the village, though never to his face. To his face he was your lordship, and the space around him was always a little wider than the space around other men. He was 34. He had a jaw that did not move when he was told things he disliked, and a habit of standing so still that people forgot he was listening. His coats were plain and beautifully made, and 4 years out of fashion, and he had not once, in Margaret's 9 years at Caudley Hall, sent one down to be altered to the new cut. She had wondered about that. A man who does not follow the season is either indifferent to it or is refusing it, and the two look identical from the sewing room. Margaret came in at the servants' door and stopped at the edge of the carpet, where she was permitted to stop. The tutor, Mr. Ambrose Finch, was in the middle of the room with his hands folded in front of him and his chin up. He was a slight man of 30, with sandy hair and a coat gone shiny at the elbows, and he had spent 4 years teaching the Earl's ward Latin and the use of the globes, and he had never once in Margaret's hearing spoken to a servant as though they were furniture. "Michaelmas," Lady Corinne said from her chair. "That gives you the summer. I am sure you will find something suitable. There are always families who require less." Mr. Finch inclined his head. He did not argue. That was the thing about him that made Margaret's throat tight. He never argued, and he was always right, and the two facts had never once helped him. At the window, the Earl said nothing at all. Margaret felt the letter in her apron pocket like a coal itself, live and waiting. Stay with her. She does not know yet what she is carrying. That night, she sat with a candle, and the letter, and a scrap of paper. And she played her father's game. The coal ledger had worked like this. You counted the words until you reached the key word, and the word that followed it was the one you kept. Coal, then keep the next. Coal again, keep the next. It was a child's cipher, the kind a man invents when he wants privacy from his wife rather than from the crown. The kind of cipher a man uses when he has never once imagined that a seamstress might be reading over his shoulder. She counted with the tip of her needle, touching each word, so as not to lose her place because a seamstress does not trust her eye. Alone, and never has. 11 lines, 94 words. The candle guttered at the 6th line, and she cupped her hand around it and went on counting in the smell of tallow, and the stable below her made its night noises, a hoof shifting, a chain settling, a horse breathing out long and slow into the dark. She counted, she kept. She wrote them down in her small hand on the back of a bill for buttons because paper cost money, and she had none of it to waste on a game. The kept words made a sentence. The sentence was about Mr. Finch. She read it, and her hands went cold, and she read it again. The letter had been written to Lady Corinne Aldworth. The letter instructed her, in the plainest terms a cipher could manage, to place a specific book in the tutor's room before the 3rd of June, and to be certain that a specific person found it there. The book was named. The person was named. The date was named. The book was a volume of Rousseau, seized twice at Dover and twice burned, which no man in England could be found with in the year of our Lord 1811 without answering for it in a manner that ended careers, and sometimes ended more than careers. Margaret sat very still in the sewing-room with a dead candle beside her, and the whole architecture of a man's ruin laid out on the table in her own handwriting. She was a pair of hands. She had just read a thing that no pair of hands was supposed to be able to read. The next morning, she went to the gallery to return the coat. The Earl was at the window again. He had a way of being in rooms before you decided to enter them. She laid the coat over the back of the chair he had indicated with 2 fingers. And she did not go. "You are still here," he said. His voice was level, the words placed one after another like stones in a wall. "There was a paper in the pocket, my lord." "Was there? I have put it back." She had. She had copied it first, in the small hours, onto the inside of a pattern piece for a sleeve, where no one on earth would look. Then she had folded the original along its creases and returned it to the breast pocket of a coat that was not the Earl's coat at all, but had been sent down from the house with the Earl's things by a footman who could not read the labels. She had known that for a full day, and had said nothing. The Earl turned. The light came round the side of him and found his face for the first time that morning, and she saw that he was looking at her hands, which were shaking, and then at her face, which was not. "Sit down," he said. There was one chair in the gallery that a servant might sit in, and it was not the chair beside the window. And he had gestured at the chair beside the window. "I would rather stand, my lord." "Sit down, Miss Vane." She sat. The chair was too soft. Her spine did not know what to do in it. She kept her feet flat on the boards, and her hands in her lap, and her eyes on the middle distance the way she had been taught. And she was aware of exactly where he was in the room, without looking at him, the way one is aware of a fire. "Whose coat?" he said. "I do not know, my lord." That was the truth. She did not know. She suspected. And suspicion was not a thing a seamstress was permitted to have out loud. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are a poor liar." And there was nothing unkind in it, and something in her chest turned over anyway. "I have not lied, my lord." "No," he agreed. "You have simply declined to finish." He crossed to the window and stood with his hands behind his back, and she watched his shoulders, and she saw the exact moment he decided not to press her. It was a small thing. It was the tension going out of the line of his neck. She had spent 9 years reading fabric under tension, and a man is only cloth with a heart in it. "Go back to your work," he said. She went. At the door she stopped because she was a fool, and said, "Mr. Finch is a good teacher, my lord." The Earl did not turn around. "I am aware," he said, The week after Easter, the house filled. Lady Corinne's brother came with his hunters, and a Mrs. Pole came with her opinions, and Miss Henrietta Selby came with 3 trunks and a face like a well-made porcelain cup. And the season, which had been happening in London to other people, arrived at Caudley Hall in a body. Margaret's work trebled, hems let down, hems taken up, a Spencer jacket recut because Miss Selby had decided that green was for other women. She worked from 6 until the candles gave out, and then a while past that by the light, off the yard lamp when the sky was clear. Green silk for Miss Selby, who had decided that green was for other women. And then, decided at 11 at night that it was not 3 yards of Brussels lace to be lifted off a gown of Lady Corinne's and laid onto another, stitch by stitch, without so much as a mark left in the old ground, which is 4 hours' work and looks like nothing when it is done. Her fingers cracked at the knuckle and she bound them with thread and kept sewing, because the alternative was to be a seamstress who could not sew, which was to be nothing at all. She kept a scrap of flannel in the workbox to wrap the needle when her grip went, and a saucer of tallow for the cracks, and she had never, in 9 years, asked anyone for anything. On the second evening, she carried a finished gown up the back stair and heard through the half-open door of the morning room Lady Corinne say her name. Vane, the sewing woman. A pair of hands, my dear. Nothing more. You must not speak to her as though she were company. It confuses them. She seemed quick, said Miss Selby. They often seem quick. It is a kind of mimicry. Margaret stood in the dark of the stair with a gown across her arms and let it pass through her, the way weather passes through a house with bad windows. She went on up. That was the first thing. The second thing was the book. She found it on a Tuesday, in the linen press outside the schoolroom, wrapped in a piece of unbleached calico that she recognized because she had cut it herself for a set of dust covers in February. Somebody had taken her calico and wrapped a book in it and hidden it 14 paces from Mr. Finch's door. She did not open it. She did not need to. The shape of it was in her handwriting on the inside of a sleeve pattern in her workbox, and the date on the letter was the 3rd of June, and it was the 9th of May. She stood in the corridor with the linen press open and understood that she had 3 weeks and no name and no station and no witness, and that if she spoke she would be a servant accusing a lady, which is not an accusation but a resignation. She closed the press. She left the book where it was, wrapped in her own cloth, 14 paces from a good man's door. She thought about taking it. She stood there and thought about it for a long time, and worked it through the way her father had taught her to work a problem, which is backward from the answer. If the book vanished, another book would come. If she burned it, she would be a woman who had burned a thing she was not supposed to have known existed. If she carried it to the Earl and laid it on his desk, she would be a servant with a banned book in her hands and a story about a letter she could not produce. And there is a word for a servant like that, and the word is not witness. The trap was not the book. The trap was that the only person in the house who could read the letter was the one person in the house whose reading did not count. Then she went and sat on the bottom step of the back stair and put her face in her raw hands and permitted herself exactly 1 minute of it before she got up and went back to work. What she did instead was this. She began to sew for Lady Corinne, not more than before, better than before. She took the woman's morning gowns and improved them past what had been asked. She discovered that Lady Corinne kept her correspondence in a rosewood box in the morning room, and that the morning room was cleaned at 7 and dressed at 9, and that between 7 and 9 there was a window of 2 hours in which a seamstress carrying a gown had a reason to be in that room and no reason to be questioned about it. She did not open the box. She never opened the box. To open it would be theft, and a thief's word is worth less than a servant's. And she had already worked out that her word was the only thing she was going to be permitted to bring to this. She only watched. Over 11 days, she carried gowns into that room at 7:30, and pinned and unpinned, and knelt on the carpet with her mouth full of pins, and being on her knees, with pins in her mouth, made her furniture, and furniture sees everything. She saw that the key to the rosewood box lived on a ribbon at Lady Corinne's waist, and came off it only twice. She saw that the housemaid Bess dusted the box, and never the papers. She saw Miss Selby come in on a Monday and be sent out again with a coolness that had nothing to do with Miss Selby. And she saw Lady Corinne's brother, Mr. Blinks, Robert Aldworth, come in on a Thursday morning with a paper in his hand, and go out without it. He stood 4 feet from a kneeling woman with pins in her mouth, and did not register that the room contained a second person. She saw the shape of his coat as he turned the particular set of the shoulder where a man carries himself higher on the right, and she knew it the way one knows a face. She had let out that shoulder seam in March. She had put in the extra half-inch herself, and had thought, at the time, that he was a man who was growing into his own opinion of himself. The coat was his, the letter was his hand. She had a name. A name in a servant's mouth is a rumor. She knew that too. The witnessing happened on a Sunday, and she did not know it was happening. The Earl's ward was a boy of 9, named Thomas, thin as a whip, who had lost both parents to a fever in Naples, and had been shipped to Caudley Hall like a parcel, and had not spoken above a whisper in 4 years. Finch had taught him Latin. Nobody had taught him anything else. That Sunday, Thomas tore the knee out of his good breeches in the rose arbor, and came to the sewing-room, white-faced, because Lady Corinne had told him twice that boys who ruined their clothes were an expense the house could not indefinitely support. Margaret sat him on the stool by the window and mended the knee with him, still in it, kneeling on the boards, working the needle in close to his skin and talking the whole time in her ordinary voice about nothing. About the sparrows in the eaves, about the way her father used to say that a torn thing mended is stronger, at the tear. "There," she said. "Now you have a secret. Only you and I know it is mended. It is a very good secret. It is nearly the best kind." Thomas said out loud in a whole voice, "Thank you, Miss Vane." Neither of them saw the Earl in the doorway. He had come to find the boy. He stood there for the length of that mending, which was 11 minutes, and he did not announce himself. And when Thomas went out past him, he put a hand very briefly on the boy's head, and the boy did not flinch. Then the Earl of Renmere went down to his study, and sat for a long time without lighting a candle. The midpoint of a man is the thing he does not say. He had married at 24. Her name had been Eleanor. She had been quick and warm, and had loved a garden, and she had written him letters when he was in London that he had not always answered because he had been busy, and because he had believed there would be a great deal of time. In the last year of her life she had begun to be unwell in a way that his mother called nerves, and his physician called delicacy, and he himself, God help him, had called nothing at all, because to name a thing is to admit it. She had told him twice that she was frightened. He had told her twice that there was nothing to be frightened of. She had been right, and he had been wrong. And she had died in the March of 1807, and the letters he had not answered were in a drawer in his study, 17 of them, tied with a black ribbon she had used for her hair. There had been a morning, the January before she died, when she had come down to the breakfast room in her wrapper, with her hair still loose, which was not a thing she did, and had stood at the end of the table and said his name once. He had a letter in his hand from his steward about the drainage in the East Fields. He had said, without looking up, that he would be with her presently. He had been with her, presently. By the time he was with her, she had gone back upstairs and dressed and put her hair up, and become a woman who had nothing to say. He had learned one thing from it, and had learned it too late. A person tells you what is true, and you decide whether the telling is worth your attention, and the deciding is not innocent. Rank does not protect a man from that arithmetic. It only means nobody corrects him afterward. He had not opened that drawer in 4 years. He had gone into the study every day of those 4 years, and sat within 3 feet of it and done the accounts of 11 farms, and answered every letter that arrived within a day of its arriving. Every letter, without exception, for 4 years, and had never once asked himself why. He opened it on the Sunday evening after he watched a seamstress mend a boy's knee, and he sat with the ribbon in his hand until the room went entirely dark. The next week, he began to appear. He appeared at the sewing-room door with no errand. He stood in the doorway with his hands behind his back and asked whether the light was sufficient, and she said that it was, and he said nothing else, and did not go. For some minutes, the light was not sufficient. It had not been sufficient since 1802. 2 days later, 4 candles arrived from the house stores with no note and no explanation, and the housekeeper wanted to know who had ordered them, and nobody had. He appeared in the corridor when she was carrying a basket, and took it from her, which caused a scandal among the housemaids that lasted 3 days. He carried it the whole length of the passage, and up the outside stair, and set it down inside her door, and looked once around the room she lived in, at the narrow bed and the workbox and the one window, and his face did not change at all, and she watched it not change, and understood that she had just been seen, and had no idea what had been made of it. He asked her once, in the passage outside the linen press, what her father had done. He taught mathematics, my lord. To whom? To boys whose fathers had money and no Latin. And to you? She had not expected that. Her breath caught, and she heard it catch, and she knew he heard it too. He taught me a game, she said. What sort of game? A child's sort. The Earl looked at her for a moment too long. In the corridor there was the smell of lavender from the press, and the cold of the stone through her shoes, and the whole length of the house. Between them and anyone, eat something, he said. You have not eaten today. That was all. He gave her a command about a meal, and walked away. And Margaret stood in the corridor with her heart going like a hammer in a shut room, and told herself firmly that a great man's kindness to a servant is a kind of weather. It arrives. It passes. It means nothing about the ground. Her hands were shaking. She looked at them and made them stop. She wanted him. She had not permitted herself the word for 11 weeks, and she permitted it now, once, in the dark of the corridor, and then she put it away in the place where she kept things that could not be used. The dark moment came on the 2nd of June, 1 day early, which was the only thing about it that surprised her. Lady Corinne was not a stupid woman. She had noticed the Earl in the corridor. She had noticed a basket carried. She had over 4 weeks watched a pair of hands become something that required managing, and she was a woman who had managed things her whole life and had never once failed. She moved the date. The dinner was for 22 in the great dining room, with the candles doubled and the good service out. Mr. Finch had been invited, which should have warned him because a tutor at Caudley Hall did not dine above stairs. He came in his shiny coat with his chin up. Margaret was there, because Miss Selby's hem had torn on the stair, and someone had to be within call, and so she stood at the end of the room in the servant's place near the door, in her plain grey gown, with a needle in her cuff. At the fish, Mr. Robert Aldworth said pleasantly that a curious thing had been found in the schoolroom wing. The book came out onto the table, unwrapped from her calico, and lay there among the silver, like something dead. The room went quiet in stages. I do not know that book, Mr. Finch said. It was in the linen press outside your door, said Mr. Aldworth. I do not know that book. 14 paces from your door, Mr. Finch. Lady Corinne set down her glass. Ambrose, she said gently, which was the cruelest thing anyone said that night. Ambrose, there is no shame in an error of judgment. There is only shame in the second one. Mr. Finch's chin came down. Margaret watched it come down, and felt something in her own chest come down with it. He is a tutor, and nothing more, Lady Corinne said to the table, to all 22 of them, in her polished voice. A pair of hands, if you like, for a boy's Latin. One does not expect judgment from such a man. One expects only that he not embarrass the house. And there it was, the 3rd time, in the 3rd setting, and it was not even about Margaret this time, which somehow made it worse. It was a shape the woman's mouth made. It fit anyone below her. At the head of the table, the Earl of Renmere had not moved. His hand rested on the stem of a glass he had not lifted. Margaret, from the servant's place by the door, saw his jaw, and it was carved stone, and she could not read it at all. Mr. Finch stood up. "I will be gone by morning," he said, "if that would be easier for the house." He walked the length of the dining room to the door, past the sideboard, past the footmen, past Margaret in her grey gown. And he did not look at her, and he was not crying, and that was the part she could not bear. She had a copy of the letter on the inside of a sleeve pattern in a workbox, in a room above the stables. She had 3 seconds. My Lord! Her own voice. In the great dining room at the servants' end, out loud. 22 faces turned. She had never in her life been looked at by 22 people at once, and her body understood before her mind did, and her hands went to fists in her skirt. Lady Corinne's fan stopped. "The sewing woman is speaking, Mrs. Pole said to no one, in genuine astonishment. "My lord," Margaret said again, and her voice did not shake, and later she would not be able to account for that. "The book was wrapped in calico. I cut that calico in February for the dust covers. It is my cloth. I know it's selvage. And there is a letter that says where the book was to be put, and on what day, and who was to find it. I have read that letter. I can produce it." The silence had a shape. It sat over the table like a lid. "You cannot read," said Lady Corinne. "I can read, my lady. You cannot read that letter." The room heard it. Every person at that table heard the shape of the sentence, and heard what had to be inside it for the sentence to exist, and Lady Corinne heard herself say it, and her hand went to her fan, and did not find it, because the fan was on the table. She had known there was a letter. She had known it was not in English. The Earl of Renmere stood up. He did not raise his voice. He put down his glass, with great care, as though it were the last object of its kind, and he came down the length of the dining room. 22 people watched him come. He passed his aunt's chair. He passed Mr. Grey. Aldworth, who had begun to say something about the impertinence of servants and did not finish it. He passed Miss Selby, who was looking at the tablecloth. He walked the whole length of that room in the candlelight, and stopped in front of Margaret Vane, who was standing in the servant's place in a plain grey gown with a needle in her cuff. He offered her his hand. "Margaret," he said. The first time her given name. In his voice, in front of the entire house, she put her hand in his. Her fingers were raw at the knuckles and bound with thread, and she did not hide them, and he closed his hand around them as though they were the ordinary hands of an ordinary woman he had every right to hold. He turned to the table. "Miss Vane reads for me. Fetch Mr. Finch back." The words were not loud. They went into the corners of that room and stayed there. Mr. Aldworth's chair scraped. "Renmere, this is a servant's word. Against a gentleman's—" "It is a servant's cloth," the Earl said. "Against a gentleman's letter. Mr. Payne can compare a hand as well as any man in the county. He is in the blue room. He has been there since Tuesday." Margaret turned her head. She had seen a stranger in the blue room corridor on Tuesday, and had thought him a horse dealer. The solicitor came in with the letter already in his hand. He was a small, dry man, with ink on his second finger, and he had the air of a person who had been asked to wait in a blue room since Tuesday, and had used the time to read everything he had been given twice. Behind him came the housemaid Bess, who had carried a coat down to the sewing room in April, and could say whose coat it had been, and on whose instruction, and who said it in a voice that shook the whole way through, and did not stop. The thing took 11 minutes. It was not dramatic, and that was its whole terrible weight. A hand was compared against a note Mr. Aldworth had written to the steward about a mare in April, and the 2 hands were the same hand, and Mr. Payne said so in the tone of a man reading a shipping list. A date was read aloud. The 3rd of June, the book was on the table on the 2nd. Then Mr. Payne asked her, in front of 22 people, to explain the cipher, and she did. She did it, standing up, with her hand still in the Earl's hand. In her ordinary voice, she said that you counted to the key word and kept the word after it. She said the key word was coal. She said it appeared 3 times in 11 lines, and that no man writing about the weather at Bath needed to say coal. 3 times. A gentleman at the far end of the table took the letter and counted for himself, moving his lips, and then set it down as though it had grown warm. Lady Corrine said, "The coal is nothing. The coal is a figure of speech." Then she said it again, and the second time she heard it, and she stopped. She sat down slowly in her chair at the head of her end of the table and put her hands flat on the cloth in front of her, and she did not weep, and nobody was cruel to her, and that was the worst of it. Mrs. Pole looked away. Miss Selby looked away. The room simply, quietly stopped agreeing with her, all at once the way a season ends. Mr. Aldworth left Caudley Hall that night and was not received in the county again. Mr. Ambrose Finch was brought back from the stable-yard with his box already strapped, and he stood in the doorway of the great dining-room with his hat in his hands, and the Earl said, "Your position is not ended. It was never yours to lose." Mr. Finch looked at Margaret across the ruined dinner. The fish had gone cold in 22 plates. The candles had burned down an inch. He had taught Latin for 4 years to a boy who would not speak, and had never once been thanked for it. And he had walked to the stable-yard tonight with his box strapped and his chin up, and had intended, she was quite sure, to go on being right about things where nobody could hear him. He inclined his head to her, only that he did not say her name. And he did not make a speech, and he did not weep. And if he had done any of those things, it would have been smaller. It was enough, and she would keep it. Lady Corrine went to her sister at Bath in the 3rd week of June. She wrote, before she went, a note to Margaret. It was 4 lines long, and it did not apologize, because she was not a woman who had the equipment for that, but it said that the calico had been well cut, and that she had not known the selvage could be told, and that she had been wrong about the hands. Margaret read it twice, and put it in her workbox, and did not answer it. There are corrections that do not require a reply. They were married in September in the small church at the edge of the park, with 11 people present and no diamonds in the building. Thomas carried nothing, and stood beside her because he asked to. Mr. G. asked Finch read the lesson in a clear voice that carried to the back. The Earl of Renmere kissed her at the church door in the cold, bright autumn light, and it was soft and it was full of promise, and it lasted precisely as long as a kiss at a church door is permitted to last, and neither of them was in any hurry, because for the first time in either of their lives there was a great deal of time, and both of them knew it. That winter, the snow came early and stayed. There is a room above the stables at Caudley Hall that nobody uses now for sewing. It is a schoolroom. The window that Margaret used to hold letters up to gets the afternoon light, and the light falls on a table where Thomas does his Latin badly and his mathematics extremely well, because his teacher is a man named Finch, and his other teacher is a woman who is taught ciphers by her father in a kitchen in Bristol and calls it a game. On the 2nd evening of December, Margaret sat with her husband by the fire in the library while the snow came down past the tall windows. Thomas was asleep somewhere above them. The house was quiet in the way that only a large house in snow is quiet. Her husband got up and went to his study, and came back with a drawer's worth of letters tied in a black ribbon, and put them in her lap. He did not explain them. She did not ask. She untied the ribbon. The letters were soft at the folds, from having been folded once and never again. The first was dated the 9th of February, 1806, and it began without ceremony, in the middle of a thought, the way people write to those they expect to see soon. She read it aloud in her ordinary voice, the way she had once talked about sparrows to a frightened boy. It was about a gardener who had planted tulips where he had been told to plant nothing, and about the weather, and about a dog. It was not a wise letter. It was not a letter for keeping. It was a woman telling her husband a small thing on a Tuesday, because he was not there to be told it in person. Her husband sat with his hand over hers and did not move at all, and she read the whole of it, and let a woman's words come back into a room they had been shut out of for 4 years. When she finished, he did not speak for a while. The fire went down. A log settled and sent up one thin line of sparks, and the snow went on past the window in the dark. And Margaret waited, because waiting was the only useful thing anyone had ever done for her, and she had learned it thoroughly. Then he said, "She would have liked you," and it was the first thing about Eleanor he had ever said out loud to anyone, and Margaret understood that she was being handed something, and that her whole task was to hold it carefully and hand nothing back. She tied the ribbon again, and set the letters on the table between them. Where they would stay outside, the snow kept on. In her workbox, in the schoolroom above the stables, there was still a pattern piece for a sleeve, with a sentence written on the inside of it in a small, exact hand. She had never thrown it out. She never would. It was not evidence any longer, and had not been for months. It was only the place where a pair of hands had written down what they knew, on the one night when nobody in the world would have believed them, and had been right anyway. She had kept it for the same reason she kept everything. A torn thing mended is stronger at the tear. Thank you for staying until the end.